Have you ever witnessed a moment where courage silenced a room? Remove that medal before you speak to this court. The judge's voice sliced through the silence, cold, clipped, certain. At the stand, the old man didn't move. His hands trembled slightly. He wore a faded blazer, and above his heart, the Medal of Honor gleamed. People shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. One or two smirked, but the veteran said nothing. He simply looked at the judge, not with defiance, but with the weight of years. Then from the back row, a man stood, dressed in full military uniform, ribbons across his chest. His voice was calm, but it stopped everything. "Your Honor, may I speak?" What happened next didn't just end a career. It reminded the nation what true honor looks like and who still carries it. Are you ready to hear how one act of respect changed everything? Walt Harlan didn't own a suit. What he wore that morning was the same thing he wore to church, to funerals, and to the last Veterans Day ceremony anyone had seen him attend. A blazer that had once been navy blue, now faded to something softer, like denim left in the sun. His boots were clean, but cracked at the edges, polished more out of respect than vanity. And his Medal of Honor, fastened just above his heart, didn't shine because he wanted it to. It simply shone because it was real. He walked slowly, carefully, not from age, but from habit. Walt had been the kind of man who checked every wire before he stepped into a helicopter. The kind who counted his tools twice before fixing a fuel line. That quiet diligence followed him even now across cracked sidewalks, past the courthouse lawn, and up the broad marble steps. Willowbend was the kind of town where folks didn't need a reason to talk. But when word got out that Walt Harlan was going to testify in public, no less, the talking turned into whispering, not gossip, not judgment, just the kind of murmured awe usually reserved for people long gone. He hadn't spoken at town meetings in decades. He wasn't the type to get involved in disputes. He lived alone, just outside of town in a two-room cabin with a wood stove and a porch that creaked when the wind shifted. Most folks under 40 didn't know who he really was. They'd see him in line at the hardware store or feeding the strays behind the VFW hall, nod politely, and move on. But the older folks remembered. They remembered the boy who enlisted at 17, the young mechanic who served 3 tours in Vietnam before disappearing into the mountains when he came home. They remembered his brother who didn't make it back and the 2 other boys from their county who did only because Walt dragged them through fire. So when he stepped onto the courthouse steps that morning, people noticed. He didn't speak, didn't look around. He just moved forward like he was following orders only he could hear. A few older veterans who sat on the benches nearby straightened up as he passed. One took off his cap. Another nodded slowly, as if saluting with his whole face. Inside, the courtroom was already half full. The usual mix of attorneys, clerks, and curious locals filled the air with the soft rustle of papers and the creak of wooden pews. But as Walt entered, a strange hush moved through the space. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was quiet in the way a room gets when something sacred walks in. He didn't carry a briefcase, no notes, no lawyer at his side. Just that old blazer, those steady steps, and the weight of something no robe, no title, no bench could ever command. The case was supposed to be straightforward, a dispute over a property easement. Who could access a strip of land, when, and why? It was the kind of civil hearing that rarely drew attention outside the people directly involved. But this one was different, and everyone in the room knew it. The judge, Raymond Colton, had been on the bench for over 2 decades. He had a reputation for being orderly, meticulous, and utterly humorless. To him, the law was a clean thing. A set of rules written in black and white, gray areas annoyed him. Sentiment irritated him, and anything that distracted from procedure was, in his words, an erosion of judicial efficiency. He entered the courtroom exactly 3 minutes past the hour. As always, he gave no eye contact to the gallery, didn't acknowledge the murmurs, and didn't glance toward the witness stand where Walt Harlan now sat, calm, quiet, and still as a mountain. Walt wasn't the kind of man to fidget. He simply folded his hands and waited. But Judge Colton saw the medal. It caught the light from the courtroom window. Not ostentatiously, not intentionally. It just was blue ribbon, bronze star, that unmistakable gleam of the Medal of Honor resting just above Walt's heart. To most in the room, it was a symbol of sacrifice, of valor, of something that belonged not just to the man wearing it, but to the nation that gave it. To Judge Colton, however, it was something else entirely, an interference, an uncontrolled variable. Before the proceedings could begin, Colton cleared his throat and leaned forward into his microphone. "Mr. Harlan," he said, his voice firm but dispassionate. "Remove that medal before speaking to this court." The words dropped into the room like a rock in a still pond. Walt didn't flinch. He didn't speak. His hands remained folded in his lap. He simply looked at the judge, not with defiance, not with anger, but with a kind of weary understanding, as if he'd met men like this before, long ago, in places with far higher stakes. The room reacted before he did. A murmur rippled through the gallery. A few gasped audibly. Others exchanged glances, unsure if they'd heard right. One elderly woman near the back shook her head slowly, her lips tightening. A younger man leaned forward in disbelief. Judge Colton, unfazed, continued. "This is a court of law," he said, almost scolding. "Not a ceremony. That medal, while no doubt meaningful, is not appropriate attire for witness testimony. Remove it or you will not be allowed to proceed." The court clerk hesitated, her eyes darting from the judge to Walt. The attorneys looked down, suddenly very interested in their legal pads. No one moved. No one spoke except Walt. Slowly he reached toward his chest. Not rushed, not shamed, but deliberate. His fingers found the pin beneath the fabric. With a small motion, he unfastened it and removed the medal. The weight of it, not physical, but historical, seemed to echo in that small act. He didn't hand it to anyone. Didn't try to hide it. Instead, he placed it gently on the ledge of the witness stand beside the microphone. It sat there, still catching light, but now displaced like a flag folded and set aside. Walt sat back in his chair, his eyes settling on a fixed point somewhere between past and present. And in that moment, the room felt wrong. Not just because of what had been said, but because of what had been silenced. The kind of silence not born of order, but of discomfort. The kind that carried a question. Who has the authority to ask a man to remove his honor? Judge Colton gave a curt nod. "You may proceed," he said, gesturing to the attorney. But something in the air had shifted. Something ancient and solemn had just been mishandled, and everyone, even those who didn't understand exactly why, could feel it. Walt's fingers moved slowly, as if even they weren't ready for what he was about to do. He didn't rush. He didn't resist. He simply obeyed the same way he had once obeyed orders in places that reeked of sweat, oil, and gunpowder. There was no performance in it, only a quiet resignation, not to the judge, perhaps, but to the moment itself. His thumb found the clasp under the frayed edge of his blazer, and with the steady care of someone handling something sacred, he unpinned the Medal of Honor from his chest. It was small, really, smaller than people often imagine. Bronze star, light blue ribbon with white stars, delicate, dignified in his hand. It seemed both weightless and impossibly heavy. The courtroom didn't make a sound. The judge shifted in his chair, rearranging papers as if the matter were settled, as if the courtroom had now returned to the proper order of things. But no one else moved. No one. Walt held the medal in his palm for a second longer. His eyes lowered, not in shame, but in memory. He wasn't seeing the judge. He wasn't seeing the courtroom. He was somewhere else entirely. For a moment, his breathing changed. Slower, heavier, like he had to pass through something unseen before he could continue. And then, gently, he placed the medal down. He didn't tuck it away in a pocket. Didn't hand it to the bailiff or set it beside his coat. He placed it right on the wooden surface of the witness stand, beside the microphone, beside the legal pads, beside the part of the courtroom where facts were spoken and decisions made. It didn't belong there, but it stayed. That was the part no one could quite process. The courtroom wasn't used to symbols like that just sitting there, unworn, unspoken for, but it gleamed in the light anyway, not as an ornament, as a statement. Across the gallery, the mood shifted. A young man who had been half asleep straightened in his chair. A middle-aged woman pressed a tissue to her mouth without realizing it. A man in the second row stared at the metal like it was something he had no right to look at. No one said anything, but silence said enough. Walt folded his hands once more. His face was calm, but the calm of a man who had been forced to carry things longer than anyone should. The prosecutor cleared his throat, but it was dry, uncertain. Even he could feel it. The absurdity of proceeding with easement boundaries and water runoff disputes while that metal sat inches away from a microphone, as if waiting for the court to notice what it had just done. Judge Colton did not acknowledge the shift. He resumed as if nothing had happened, as if justice were still neatly intact. But those who were watching closely, especially those who had served, those who had lost, those who had waited years for silence to be broken, knew better. They knew that what had just taken place wasn't simply procedural. It was personal. And in trying to strip the room of sentiment, the judge had done something far worse than allow emotion. He had provoked reverence, a quiet kind of reverence, the kind born not from applause or protest, but from stillness, from shared recognition. No one dared to touch the metal. Not the attorneys, not the clerk, not even the bailiff who kept casting glances at it the way one might look at a folded flag during a funeral. Respectful, reverent, unsure of permission. It just sat there. The highest military honor the United States can bestow. Laid on a wooden railing beside a microphone. Like evidence, like burden, like something too sacred to belong to this room and too important to be removed. And Walt, he just sat there still, silent, as if the real testimony had already been given. The room didn't breathe as Walt Harland began to speak. His voice was quiet, not from weakness, but from a life spent saying only what needed saying, gravel-lined, steady, measured. Every word he uttered was simple, unembellished. But in the space between syllables, there was something unshakable, like a current beneath calm water. The attorney adjusted his tie and stepped forward, doing his best to maintain the rhythm of normal courtroom questioning. Mr. Harlan. For the record, please state your full name and current occupation. Walter Joseph Harland, Walt said without hesitation. Retired, former helicopter crew chief, 1st Air Cavalry Division, U.S. Army. A pause followed. The lawyer blinked, then nodded. And you were present at the property line the morning of July 14th. I was. Can you describe what brought you there? Had a call from my neighbor, Ed Langley. He said the irrigation trench behind our properties was backing up again. Asked if I could meet him and take a look. Said he'd bring the valve key. And what did you find when you arrived? Walt looked straight ahead as if replaying the memory before speaking. There were two men, not Ed, didn't recognize either of them. They were wearing suits. One had a laser rangefinder. Said I was trespassing. And were you? Walt's expression didn't change, but his next words landed with quiet force. I've had a key to that gate since 1987. Ed gave it to me himself. Told me his father would have wanted me to use the land anytime I needed it. Why is that? Walt's gaze sharpened. Because his father and I served in the same fire base. I pulled his father from a wrecked Huey. Took a piece of shrapnel doing it. Man didn't walk right again, but he lived. The attorney stopped. It wasn't written in his notes, and he didn't need to follow it up. Everyone in the room heard what mattered. Across the aisle, the opposing counsel scribbled something, but his pen hand slowed. Did you see any signs indicating you were prohibited from entering that day? No, sir. Same rusted chain, same faded sign. Been like that 20 years. And have you ever had reason to believe the easement had changed? No, thank you. The attorney stepped back, but the silence that followed wasn't like others. It wasn't awkward. It was heavy, like no one wanted to break it. The judge shifted uncomfortably as if trying to redirect the tone. He glanced toward the other lawyer. Cross-examination? The younger man stood slowly, smirking faintly, as if trying to re-establish the courtroom's balance. Mr. Harlan, he said too casually. Would you agree that memories fade with time? Walt blinked once, then answered. I remember the names of the men who died under me. I don't forget those. The smirk faltered. No further questions, the lawyer muttered. Walt looked back toward the front, his expression unreadable. He wasn't testifying for himself. Not really. He was speaking for something larger, not written in the court record, but felt by everyone in that room. The silver star sat quietly on the stand beside him. He didn't look at it. He didn't have to. Judge Colton leaned back in his chair, tapping the edge of his pen against the wood, his eyes flicking toward the silver star still resting beside the microphone, his jaw tightened. This court, he said slowly, deals in facts, not sentiment. His voice echoed too loudly in the silence that followed. A few heads turned, not toward him, but toward the medal, toward the man who had worn it. Colton noticed, and that only seemed to harden his tone. I don't care how many medals someone's collected, he added, deliberately avoiding the words Medal of Honor or Valor. Respect in this room is earned through procedure, not nostalgia. A low murmur stirred in the gallery, quickly silenced by Colton's sharp glance, but the damage was done. A few people in the audience began to shift uncomfortably, their eyes moving between the judge and the elderly man, still seated at the witness stand. Walt hadn't flinched. He remained still, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes forward. If the judge's words pierced him, he didn't show it, but others did. Near the back of the room, an older man with a Vietnam veteran's cap clenched the arms of his seat. A younger woman beside him reached over, gently resting her hand on his wrist. Across the aisle, someone quietly removed their own cap, not out of protocol, but reverence. Colton pressed on, unaware or uncaring that the atmosphere around him had shifted entirely. We're not here to relive war stories, he said. We're here to settle a property dispute. Let's not turn this courtroom into a museum. He might as well have spat. That line, flippant, dismissive, hollow, was the moment things turned. Not with shouting, not with protest, but with something deeper. A collective tightening of the air, a stillness that said, "You've gone too far." Even the attorneys looked uncomfortable now. The prosecutor stared down at his notes as if hoping they'd shield him from the weight in the room. The defense counsel suddenly looked younger, smaller, unsure of the courtroom he thought he could control with clever phrasing. Judge Colton glanced around, sensing that he'd lost something, but not sure what. He cleared his throat and muttered, "Let's continue." As if by force of will, he could reset the room. But the room had already changed. It wasn't about boundary lines anymore, not irrigation, not easements. It was about dignity, about the quiet power of a man who had said little, and yet said everything by simply placing his medal down and sitting in silence. And though Colton still held the gavel, he no longer held the room. Walt turned slightly, his gaze resting for a moment on the silver star, not to reclaim it, not yet, but just to acknowledge what the judge had tried and failed to diminish. The judge had just finished speaking. Something occurred about moving on when it happened. A chair creaked near the back of the gallery, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the silence that had fallen after Judge Colton's dismissive words. A man stood. He hadn't been noticed before. Not really. He'd entered quietly, taken a seat near the rear of the courtroom without a word. Nothing about him had demanded attention until now. He wore the deep green of a formal U.S. Army dress uniform. His posture was straight, boots polished to a mirror shine. His chest carried rows of ribbons perfectly aligned. And at the center, unmistakably, sat the Medal of Honor. People turned in unison, their heads moving as one. Even those who had checked out moments earlier were now leaning forward, alert, eyes wide. The man didn't step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Your Honor," he said, calm and even. "May I speak?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The kind of voice that didn't ask permission so much as announced presence. Authority wrapped in quiet. Judge Colton blinked, surprised. He shifted in his seat, uncertain. For the first time all morning, he looked off balance. "This is a court of law," Colton replied, grasping for control. "Unless you've been subpoenaed or are acting as legal counsel." "I am neither," the man said, not moving. "But I served 3 tours in Iraq, to in Afghanistan, and I have earned the right to speak when a decorated veteran is humiliated in open court." His words landed with a weight that no gavel could match. Colton opened his mouth, then closed it again. The courtroom was still, not frozen, reverent. Then slowly, a man in the third row stood. An older gentleman with a faded Marine Corps pin on his lapel. He didn't say anything. He just stood. A moment later, another, a woman, Army, judging by the bracelet on her wrist, stood as well. Then a third, removing his cap and pressing it to his chest. They weren't making a scene. They weren't protesting. They were bearing witness. One by one, veterans throughout the room rose to their feet. The man in uniform still hadn't moved. He remained at the back, his eyes fixed on the judge. Then gently, he repeated himself. "May I speak, Your Honor?" Colton said nothing. He didn't need to. The room had already answered. For the first time all morning, Judge Colton didn't speak. Not because he didn't want to, but because he no longer knew how to reassert control. The man in uniform stood motionless at the back of the courtroom, hands behind his back, eyes forward, his Medal of Honor catching the light like a quiet challenge. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward the bench. He simply held the room. Then he took one step forward, then another. The echo of his boots on the tile floor was all anyone could hear. Walt didn't move. He remained seated, hands folded, eyes lowered slightly. Not from shame, but from knowing, from recognition. As the officer walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom, more veterans stood. First 3, then 5, then nearly a dozen. No chants, no protests, just men and women rising in silence. Caps in hand, heads bowed, expressions locked in a mix of reverence and quiet outrage. The officer reached the witness stand. He didn't speak yet. Instead, he looked down at the silver star resting there beside the microphone. For a moment, he just stared at it like someone standing at a gravesite. Then, with both hands, he lifted the medal. Not like an object, like a memory, like something sacred. He held it for a second longer than anyone expected. Then, he turned to the judge. "This," he said softly, holding the medal up just slightly, "is not jewelry. It's not for display. It's not for attention. It is a gravestone that fits in your hand." The judge stiffened. The man took a step closer, never raising his voice. "I knew Walt Harland," he said. "Not from newspapers, not from ceremonies, from Cambodia. He pulled my commander out of a burning chopper with one arm shattered in fire all around. Then he turned around and went back for the crew. He didn't speak of it, didn't want to, but I was there." No one moved. Even the stenographer's hands had gone still. "You asked him to remove this medal," he continued. "But you didn't just ask him to take off a piece of metal. You asked him to separate himself from what he's lived through, from the men he lost. From the blood that stained his hands so yours wouldn't have to." He turned slightly, facing the gallery now, facing the veterans who had risen. "You talk about courtroom decorum," he said. "But what you really mean is comfort. You are uncomfortable sitting across from something you've never earned. And so you try to diminish it." Judge Colton opened his mouth, but no sound came. The officer turned back toward Walt. "You didn't remove it," he said gently. "You surrendered it, and that's what hurts the most." Finally, Walt stood. He and the officer looked at each other, neither smiling. And then they embraced, not with drama, not for the crowd, but the way soldiers do when words are too small for what's shared between them. When they stepped apart, Walt took the medal back, but he didn't pin it on. He simply held it in his hand. The officer turned back to the judge one last time. "You've embarrassed a war hero in front of his peers, his neighbors, and your own staff," he said. "The consequences of that decision aren't mine to deliver." Then, without another word, he turned and walked down the aisle. As he passed each row, veterans stood straighter. Some saluted quietly, some simply nodded. And one by one as he walked, the entire courtroom rose. Not clapping, not speaking, just rising in silence, in witness, in judgment of the man behind the bench. By the end of that week, the courtroom moment was everywhere. It started with a shaky cell phone clip uploaded by someone sitting near the back, just 47 seconds long. No filters, no edits, just a quiet voice asking, "May I speak?" followed by the slow rise of veterans across the gallery. The video spread faster than court transcripts ever could, passed between veteran forums, family group chats, and eventually national newsrooms. Headlines followed. Judge demands war hero removed medal. Silence ends his career. The day honor spoke louder than the gavel. He surrendered the medal, but the nation stood up. By Monday, the story had hit every major outlet. News anchors used words like disgrace, indignity, and misconduct. But it wasn't the media that forced change. It was the veterans. Over 200 active duty and retired officers signed a public statement condemning Judge Colton's behavior. Military support organizations issued formal letters to the State Judicial Conduct Board. A retired Navy admiral appeared on national television, calling Colton's action an institutional insult to every man and woman who has ever earned a combat decoration. Complaints poured in, not from political groups, not from legal scholars, but from ordinary Americans, teachers, nurses, truck drivers, veterans, people who had never written to a government office in their life, sent hand-signed letters to the court demanding accountability. Sponsors pulled out of Colton's re-election campaign. Local bar associations issued quiet rebukes. Even a sitting senator, herself the daughter of a Korean War veteran, tweeted that a courtroom that silences honor cannot claim to serve justice. And Judge Raymond Colton, he gave no interviews, no press conference, no apology. On Thursday morning, a brief statement was posted on the courthouse bulletin. Effective immediately, Judge Raymond Colton will be stepping down for personal reasons. All scheduled cases have been reassigned. Shape: no mention of the medal, no mention of Walt Harland, no mention of the moment that brought everything crashing down. But everyone knew. By Friday his nameplate was gone from the courtroom door. He had entered that week as a man with complete authority. He left it as a man remembered for a single order. Not one written in a ruling, but one spoken out loud. Remove that medal before speaking to this court. And in the end, that sentence wasn't remembered for its power. It was remembered for what followed. The silence, the stand, and the voice that made a nation listen. The courtroom never formally acknowledged the moment. No plaque, no gesture, just absence. But across the country, something shifted. And somewhere in a quiet town, Walt Harland returned home. Medal still in hand, never needing to say another word. Walt Harland didn't speak to reporters. He didn't return phone calls from radio hosts or answer letters from curious strangers. When a local journalist showed up at his porch a week after the courtroom incident, he listened politely, then said only, "There's nothing that needs explaining," and went back to splitting firewood. He hadn't wanted any of it. Not the attention, not the headlines, not the applause. He hadn't stood in that courtroom to make a point. He had stood there because someone asked him to, because a neighbor needed a witness, because he said he would. That was the way Walt lived and the way he returned home. Back to his small cabin just outside town. Back to his porch with the creaky step and the chipped coffee mug left by his late wife. Back to his habits, early morning walks, quiet nods at the gas station, and feeding the 3 stray cats that waited for him every evening by the shed. But something had changed. Not in Walt. He was the same. Still wore the same coat. Still sat in the same pew on Sundays. Still parked his rusted truck under the same sycamore tree on Main Street. No, the change was in the town. People who had once passed him without a second glance now paused. Not to crowd him, not to praise him, but to offer a nod, a handshake, a quiet thank you that held more weight than a whole speech. The kind of recognition that didn't come with noise, only understanding. Young men who hadn't known what the Medal of Honor even looked like before now whispered about it in the barbershop. High school students asked their history teacher if they could write essays about the old man in the courtroom. A local pastor rewrote his Sunday sermon, not to speak of war, but of dignity. And Walt, for his part, let it pass through him. He never pinned the medal back on, but he didn't hide it either. It now rested on a small wooden stand in his living room, just beneath a folded flag and beside a photograph of 3 men in uniform, one of them forever 20. He never told the full story. He didn't need to, because in one brief moment, in a courtroom built to judge, he had reminded a town and a country what honor sounds like when it doesn't need to raise its voice. Walt didn't want to be remembered, but he was. Not because he stood tall, but because when someone tried to make him smaller, he didn't rise up. He simply didn't bow. Some stories don't need a grand ending. They just need to be remembered. Walt Harlan never asked for recognition. He didn't stand in that courtroom to make a statement, but his silence spoke for thousands of men and women who have quietly carried the weight of service long after the fighting stopped. What happened that day wasn't just about a courtroom or a medal. It was about how we as a society choose to recognize dignity, not with headlines or ceremonies, but with basic human respect. It was about the quiet power of integrity and how one man's stillness could reveal the noise in all of us. In today's fast-moving world where loudness often passes for truth and outrage drowns out quiet courage, maybe Walt's story reminds us of something older, something simpler. That honor isn't loud, that strength isn't forceful, and that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one that refuses to shout. So, here's the question I leave with you. Have we forgotten how to honor humility? Have we become so used to spectacle that we overlook the quiet men and women who have earned more than applause? They've earned our silence, our listening, our thanks. Let us know what this story made you reflect on. Have you witnessed quiet acts of strength in your life? Maybe from a parent, a neighbor, a fellow veteran. Do you think today's society still understands what real respect looks like? Leave a comment below. We want to hear your stories, your memories, your thoughts, especially if you've served or know someone who has. This space is for you. If this story moved you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the Valor Stories channel. We're building a community that honors stories like Walt's, not for fame, but for truth. And remember, sometimes the greatest acts of courage are not shouted, but simply endured. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next Valor Stories video.